Hello everyone. So about half a year ago, I was interested in what the Koreans were doing for their Reflux builds. So I went on Loawa, which is their armory website for all the top players, grabbed 100 Reflux builds from there, analyzed them, and made a video about it. If you're interested in checking out that video, I'll leave it in the description below. Since then, the game has changed in a lot of different ways. We added a new raid in a con, and more recently we had a balance patch which actually changed Reflux for the first time in a long time. So that kind of got me thinking. I wanted to kind of do the exact same video that I did 6 months ago, but I wanted to see the differences between 6 months ago and now, and to see how the builds have changed and evolved and things like that. So, I've gathered information about 100 Korean Reflux builds from Loawa. All of this data was gathered by hand. All players that you see in this dataset are within the top 200 by item level, and you might say, why not just the top 100? Because I excluded players that did not have a full build, were doing some kind of PvP maybe, some kind of chaos dungeon, or something else that didn't seem like they were raiding at the time. There are a lot of Igniter players that use a Reflux build for Chaos Dungeon, so I had to filter them out. And so you can see the data on the left here. This data will be made available for download in the description, so if you want to play around with it, if you want to double check that I've done all the analysis right, then I welcome you to do so. If you find any mistakes, please let me know in the comments down below. But these are all hyperlinks that you can actually click on that'll take you to their Loawa Armory page. So I have things like their item level, the set that they're using, a general description of their build, some notes on their skills and engravings, and their general distribution of gems. So looking at the breakdown very simply, we have 3 builds. We have the Crit Instant Cast, Swift Instant Cast, and Casting Reflux. Of course, there are many different variations within each one, but you can generally categorize Reflux builds into one of these 3 things, and here are the percentage breakdowns. Crit took the overwhelming majority at 75%, Swiftness was at 16%, and Casting was at 9%. Now, if you compare this to my video from half a year ago, Crit saw an 18% increase in players, Swiftness saw a 8% decrease in players, and Casting saw a 10% decrease in players. So now what I'd like to do is take a look at each of the builds, then talk about the trends that you can actually look at directly from Loawa, and then kind of give you my thoughts. So for Crit Instant Cast, the engravings were Reflux, Grudge, Keen Blunt Weapon, Hitmaster, Curse Doll, and Adrenaline 1 and 2. That's pretty common for the Korean server because they have those ancient accessories. In our version, it's perfectly fine to replace Curse Doll with Adrenaline instead. In fact, I'd recommend it. If you are not running Enhanced Strike or Magic Amplification, and instead you're running Final Strike, you simply replace Keen Blunt Weapon with Curse Doll. And in Korea, they typically like to use Raid Captain as their last level 1 or level 2 engraving, but you'll also see a lot of players using Ether Predator 1. So for the notes, if it says standard, that just means that it's instant cast with Blaze, Reverse Gravity, Esoteric Reaction, Rhyme Arrow, Frost Call, Seraphic Hail, Punishing Strike, and usually a counter skill, which is pretty stock and standard, the most cookie cutter Reflux build. If you see a skills and then you have A, comma, or parentheses B, that means that they added A skills and they removed B skills from the standard set. So for example, Explosion, parentheses FC, means that they added Explosion and removed Frost Call. For the gems, they're formatted as AB, where A is the damage gems and B is the cooldown gems. So for example, 7-4 means 7 damage gems and 4 cooldown gems. And for the relic sets, pretty much everyone used 6 Nightmare except for 1 person, and that 1 person I believe used 2 Nightmare for Dominion, which doesn't really work well for crit in a long fight. I'm guessing that was probably something like a Guardian Raid or something like that, but maybe there is a build out there that utilizes that, although I'm kind of skeptical about it. Probably a Sonaville build or something like that. So if we take a look at the breakdown, about 41% are just using the standard instant cast suite of spells. Another 41% are using Doomsday in favor of a little bit more burst into the build. If we take a look at what skills that they replace, it's generally going to be Seraphic Hail, as you can see here, but in some instances, some people will also replace Reverse Gravity and Frost Call. Explosion saw a nice buff on the balance patch that we just had, so you can see that some people are experimenting with it in their build, and you'll see that pretty much everyone decided to replace Frost Call with, one person replacing Seraphic Hail instead. There were some people that took this to the extreme. Instead of just taking one big burst spell, they took two big burst spells, bringing our number of burst spells essentially to 3. You have Explosion, Doomsday, and Punishing Strike, and now you're playing a pseudo-casting build, but it's mainly instant cast, right? So these players typically are the ones who are innovating heavily. One of them is this guy, if I can find them. Their name basically translates to banana, banana, banana. But they've done a lot of work and a lot of understanding, and they actually removed Rhyme Arrow from the build because they felt that Seraphic Hail had a cooldown that matched the build a little bit better. If you're interested in their testing, I will leave a link to this person's build in the comments below, so if you want to see it for yourself, you can test it out. In any case, for the Western version as it is right now, because we won't get these changes for Explosion likely until probably March or April, it doesn't really matter to us. And then shout out to that one person who decided to run Inferno because they really liked the skill, I guess, and they took out Frost Call, which is actually a pretty common thing to do in a con, because having extra weak point is very, very helpful. For the gems, a lot of people, whether you're using the standard build or the Doomsday or the Explosion or whatever, are using a 6 damage and 5 cooldown setup. They often leave a Frost Call gemless to basically just have it as a throwaway skill to ensure that you use it for just maintaining boundless MP. But there has been a shift amongst some players to use 7 damage gems and 4 cooldown gems. The idea is that you don't really need cooldown gems on things like Blaze or Reverse Gravity. While in a vacuum, having cooldown gems on those skills are great for DPS. In a real raid, you won't be able to abuse that cooldown as much. So having more damage gems, like having one, for example, on Frost Skull, may benefit you a little bit. But there is a disclaimer that I need to say here, and is that in Korea, they can afford 7 maxed out skills, where in our version, we can afford 6 and then 1 at level 10. So it is important to note that they can be a little bit more flexible with their gem allocation than us. I'd personally recommend sticking with 6 damage, 5 cooldown, but if you've found a setup that works with 7 damage and 4 cooldown, then more power to you. And as we saw, Doomsday usually replaced Seraphic Hail, and Explosion usually replaced Frost Call. So that's the breakdown for Crit Instant Cast, by far the most popular build right now for Reflux in Korea. Let's take a look at Swiftness, Reflux, Grudge, Hitmaster, Raid Captain, Adrenaline, and Ether Predator 1/2. The reason why this build uses Raid Captain instead of Cursed Stall or Keen Blunt is because they have the movement speed to make it efficient. Disrespect 1 was also a common last engraving because it's going to be really cheap to run, and it does a decent amount of damage and doesn't have to ramp up like Ether Predator does. Standard does the same thing as we had before with your standard set of skills. Again, same explanations that I have over here. And we had a good amount of relic set variation with Swiftness, right? With one person even using 6 Hallucination, which was an interesting build that I found. So in this case, I've divided it up more into instant cast versus having some kind of burst spell, explosion, or doomsday. And you can see that the split is a little bit more even, right? In my last video, I believe it was favored more towards instant cast. As the game is right now, it's favoring burst more and more and more. I'm sure anyone who has done, for example, Belshazzar Gate 6 understands this quite well with the DPS holds and things like that. You have a limited time to do DPS and then you have to hold, which gives, all the burst classes times to build up meter, time to, get their cooldowns back and so on and so forth. And when it's time to push, they send all their bursts and you're kind of left there maybe doing 1 or 2 rotations and it feels really, really bad. And that's why a lot of Reflux builds nowadays have some kind of burst incorporated into it so they can compete just a little bit better. For the relic sets, most people are still going to run the standard 6 Nightmare. It's not the most optimal in terms of DPS, but you can turn your brain off and just damage the boss. If you start to mix in some Dominion, that'll generally give you better results. The popular variation in Korea right now is 2 Nightmare 4 Dominion because they can utilize that damage because they already have high cooldowns. But 4 Dominion 2 Nightmare is also a thing as well. And then 6 Hallucination, which was a build by this person over here. They actually took every single Mind Enhancement tripod, which I found to be interesting. I haven't done any testing myself, but I'd love to see that build in action, so I might test it out a little bit later myself. And for the gems, because Swiftness has a lot of cooldown inherently, you can afford more damage gems on your core damage skills, so that's what I would recommend doing. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about casting. So for casting Reflux, Grudge, Hitmaster, all at attack because you use casting abilities. And then your last engraving is kind of a toss-up. You have Precise Dagger if you want high crit with complete consistency and you don't have to stack it up with Adrenaline, Curse Stall for the highest ceiling if you're playing with crit synergies, and Adrenaline if you feel like you can maintain those stacks by your skills. And then from there, it's either Adrenaline or Ether Predator as a level 1 or level 2. Again, everything else as I had before, everyone was using 6 Nightmare and Final Strike tripods on the casting skills, and there were some builds that actually decided to use Lightning Bolt instead of Frostcaller or Seraphic Hail. Given that this build is running Final Strike, which wants your crit rate to be as high as possible, you can see that the majority choose to take a crit engraving over the damage engraving, unless you can guarantee that you play with some kind of crit synergy, and the gems are about even here. Okay, so if I go back to this page, you'll notice, the elephant in the room, that Swift and Casting have taken a noticeable hit since the last video compared to what we have here. So, of course, this made me a little bit curious, right? Where did all these players go, or so on and so forth? So I went through that data set, and here's basically what happened. A lot of Swiftness players, right, either converted to crit or stopped playing. It was one of the two. All the casting players, a good majority of them, converted to Igniter, right? And I know that's a joke that we make at some casting players' expense, saying things like, well, I mean, if you're using all these casting abilities, why not just play Igniter? But it seems to be coming a little bit true in Korea. A lot of them have indeed switched to Igniter. So instead of just looking at the top 100 players from the data that I gathered by hand, you can actually use Loawa to filter based on engravings and trends. So I want to show that here. So here's what it looks like. So over here you can see that when your item level is 1600 or above, so this is hard icon ready, the distribution is about 75% Igniter and 25% Reflux. A small percentage of characters are not using Igniter or Reflux, but these typically we bundle together with Reflux anyway. However, if you jump up that item level to 1615, then you get an 85-15 split. And this kind of goes to show you the state of Reflux in Korea right now. Burst is king, and pretty much no other class does it better than Igniter. What you can also look at, however, right, if you just want to focus on Reflux, is the breakdown of level 3 engravings of all of the characters who have Reflux equipped somewhere in their build. So if we take a look at, for example, Raid Captain, you can see here that the percentage of players that are 1600 item level or above that are using Raid Captain 3, which is typically only used by Swiftness players, is about 21%. And then you have All Out Attack, right, which again is typically an engraving only used by casting Reflux at 10%. But here's the catch with this data. These engraving counts include any build with Reflux. So builds for Chaos Dungeons, for PvP, for anything like that. And if you've ever watched Saintone's stream, if you've ever seen him do Chaos Dungeon on his Sorceress, you know that he plays a casting Reflux build in that, and that tends to be a pretty common thing. A lot of these, so these numbers are a little bit inflated and a little bit inaccurate. But take them as you will, right? They're roughly similar to the numbers that I were giving you here, so you can kind of see this as a trend of how these builds are doing in Korea. So to kind of wrap up this video, I don't want to, say anything about, a build being viable or non-viable. Given that these are the highest item level players in the game, and you see a representation of each of the builds, no matter how small or how big, it should tell you that that build is viable, and if you enjoy that style, you should consider playing it. Swiftness has a lot of merit. You're very fast. I was gonna say swift, but that'd be redundant. You're very fast, you're very mobile, you contribute a lot through stagger and weak point and destruction and countering, and you're pretty much the ultimate, tool for doing anything. You can do damage, you can do stagger, you can do a lot of different things, right? Whereas casting is kind of the mini burst version of Igniter with a little bit more safety and reliability built in, and that shouldn't be underestimated by any circumstances as all. So with that, I hope you found this video interesting. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts, again, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. And with that, that's all I have for you today. So I'll see you in the next one, and take care.